Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Speaker Spotlight. My name is Dave Murray. I am the senior consultant for the Julius Group. And this is a series where we get a chance to have a conversation with the great speakers that we have coming to the 2018 Customer Service Revolution Conference, formerly known as the Secret Service Summit. This year held in Cleveland, Ohio on October 24th and 25th. We have such great speakers every year. If you've been to the conference before, you know that. And I really enjoy this opportunity to chat with them and give you a preview of what they'll be talking about when they're at the conference and speaking from the stage. Today, I am honored to have Pete Smith join us. And let me tell you a little bit about Pete because he's got a great background. I'm really excited about this topic too. So Pete is an international speaker and trainer in the field of leadership management and personal growth. And here's the thing that's cool. He wrote a book. It was a number 2 bestseller in business motivation and self-improvement called Dare to Matter. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to picking that one up. It sounds great. The other thing that Pete has on his resume is prior to starting Smith Impact, which is his company that he leads now, he was both in the nonprofit and for-profit world and really practicing what he preached, where he really learned what he's talking about today. So, Pete, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a privilege to have you. I can't wait to have you in front of our audience at the Secret Service Summit. And here's my first question for you, because you talk about communication, and we were just talking briefly before we came live on the air. I really see communication as one of those things that is a personal development opportunity that people don't really focus on maybe as much as they should. It's almost kind of like we feel we communicate so much that we're okay with it, we're good at it, but it really seems like there are some
There you are. Can you hear me? Hello. Can you hear me? Hello. Are you there? Can you see me? Hello? Dave?
Hello, Pete. Can you hear me?
I got you.
And we're back. I just want to make sure you had enough time to ponder the answer to that question.
I did. Well, one of the first things, one of the most important elements of communication is actually being able to hear and understand someone else. So this works out great.
All right. Well, technology is wonderful, isn't it? So we are still live. We had a little gap of time there where we had to refresh. I lost Pete. Pete's back. I seem to be back. Hopefully everyone can hear us. I'm seeing some notes on the screen that people can hear us. So let's jump back into it if we can, Pete. And just to refresh the question that I asked you, you talk about personal history being so important in how we communicate. And so I just wonder if you can expand on that a little bit, what that means.
Yeah, it's history, but it's more than that. I think one of the biggest messages that I want to share with the attendees at the Customer Service Revolution is that there's a huge difference between content and context. We're so used to the content of a conversation. What we don't typically look at is the context. And one of the biggest areas regarding our context is our own history. In other words, think about context. We have this content that we see before us, but it's the way that we make things mean something. If someone says something, we have one person in the room who's hysterically laughing and another person who's in tears crying. The content was exactly the same. The difference is in how those individuals are interpreting that information, and that's context. And so our history adds a lot to our context. Our history adds to or influences how we start interpreting the information that we see. And it's history, it's experiences, it's our worldview. All of that goes into heavily influencing the way that we interpret information and the things that we see and what we hear.
That's really interesting to me. And again, I feel like it's one of those things that's so overlooked today as we're trying to make ourselves better in our career and personal growth and all those things that we do to make ourselves better. And we had a conversation offline that I wanted to ask you about for our audience. You talk a little bit about how your own personal history impacted you and how you're doing what you're doing today. Can you share that a little bit with our audience?
Yeah, sure. The short version is that 8 years ago, I had a stroke at the age of 35. And during the stroke, I lost my speech. I was temporarily paralyzed on one side of my body. And, that's a terrifying experience, as you would imagine. But there was this moment during the stroke when I heard my body begin to shut down. If you think about turning a car off or a lawnmower off, anything that has an engine, you turn it off, you start to hear the engine wind down and the gears start winding down. And in that moment, I thought, I'm dying. Right here, right now, I have about 60 seconds left to live. Like, this is it. And so in those moments, you tend to forget about everything else that doesn't matter, and you really focus on the things that do. And what I thought about was whether or not I was significant. Did I live in a way that was really a significant life? Did I matter? And that's the short version. Obviously, the story has a happy ending. I didn't die. I regained my speech. I'm still here, and just an absolute blessing and a recovery. But what's interesting about that is since that stroke, I've had this somewhat, I'll say, mild obsession about what it actually means to live in a very significant way and what are the things that really matter. And so in looking at life that way and interacting with people through that lens, I start to recognize that communication matters. The words that we use matter. The information that we share matters. The connections that we form, the relationships that we form, those are all the things that matter. And so communication is so vast because it covers every aspect of our life. You can't, or very rarely is someone a great communicator personally and awful professionally, or vice versa. I mean, we bring our own skills and techniques and effectiveness or ineffectiveness with being a great communicator in every aspect of life. And it affects our relationship in every aspect. And so I started diving in and looking at communication a little bit more. But here's what I found, Dave. When you look at a lot of the trainings and the sessions and most of the information revolved around becoming a more effective communicator, 9 times out of 10, it comes back to saying that 100% of communication exists in body language, tone, and words. There's these fictitious percentages where X% of communication is body language, this is tone, these are words, and they all add up to 100%. And I think that's the biggest fallacy regarding communication, is that 100% of it exists in those 3 things. I think there's another whole side of it that influences our effectiveness, both as a communicator and the message that we're trying to get across, that very rarely gets discussed. And so that's what I focus on in these types of trainings, is let's take a look at the other side of communication that is impacting how well you are as a communicator, how well you're doing as a communicator.
Wow, what a fascinating story. And I know our audience is really going to be interested to hear not only what you talk about today, but your personal path to get to what you're doing today. It's really, really fascinating. As I was preparing for our interview and knowing your focus on communication, I started to think back to my own college courses. I was in the College of Communication, and I think back to the fact that a lot of the communication classes were focused on you as an individual being in different communication environments, right? So it was organizational behavior communication or personal communication. And it was almost like, okay, you communicate the same, but you just have to adapt to these different environments, which really isn't necessarily the case. As you're saying, we need to focus on a lot of things beyond just what we're doing, what we're saying. That there's so many things involved. Like you just mentioned, it's beyond those 3 things that we typically think about. Yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask you, because I feel this is a very overlooked part of communication, is listening. And you talk about the fact that we all have biases that play into how we listen. And I think what you do that's really important is help build awareness about those. Can you talk about that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, and that's really the big key, is becoming more self-aware about the way that we quickly jump to our assumptions and judgments. When we hear other people talking, immediately internally we go in response mode to what's the message that I want to relay back to that person. So in other words, we tend to put ourselves, our top priority, even in those conversations. How do I want to come across to this person talking to me, instead of really stepping back and trying to grasp exactly what it is that they're sharing with us in that moment. And so part of that awareness is, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're someone that thrives in those situations where you're a great problem solver. Well, that impacts the way that you start listening to what someone is telling you. If they're sharing a story, you may be more inclined to find the problem and offer a solution. And that may have nothing to do with what they're talking about. And so part of it, again, is just looking at what's your natural inclination in a conversation, and create that awareness. And then also what I want to share with the attendees at the Customer Service Revolution is to introduce them to a listening lens that I think is going to be most advantageous to them, not just in customer service, but in conversations as a whole. And so that's one of the things I'm going to share with them, is a listening lens that will force them to react or respond in a way that they'll find to be more beneficial as they're communicating with someone else.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to that. I know that I firmly believe it's something that we can all focus on more and be better when it comes to listening and giving our attention. So I'm really looking forward to that tool myself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, my wife was a big key in helping me understand that. So, kudos to her for really bringing that to the forefront of our relationship. So that was great.
That is great. You brought up the theme of self-awareness. And another thing I know that you speak about is that sometimes we use trigger words that automatically start behaviors in others or thought process in others, which isn't what we want at all.
Right.
And maybe some of these trigger words we just use by habit. And again, it's lack of self-awareness. Where do you find us using these things? What are some of the examples of what that looks like?
Well, when we talk about trigger words, really what we're triggering is someone else's fear, self-doubt, or insecurity about themselves. Now, look, we could spend a whole session talking about fear, self-doubts, and insecurities because of the role and the importance that they play in our lives. And it's a fascinating look at what we all carry around with us, even though we never talk about those things. It's not common for us to walk around and say things like, how are you feeling today? And someone responds with, I don't know, totally inadequate. How about you? Well, like I'm screwing up my life. Great, let's get a burger. Like we don't have those conversations. We become more concerned about presenting ourselves in a way where you will only see what I want you to see. And so we all have fears. We all have these self-doubts. We all have insecurities. We walk around with them every day. We've created them. And there are certain phrases that someone will say that'll trigger that fear. And, part of the fears that I'm talking about, it's not the snakes, the spiders, the heights. Those are fears. But I'm talking more about the fears that trigger the ego, the fears that trigger someone's the pride. And there are certain words that will trigger that. And one example I'll give you is the word should. Think about how often someone says, oh, you should have done that, or you shouldn't have done that. That word, should or shouldn't, that is a trigger word.
Pete, can you hear me?
You're back.
Yes.
Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. I apologize. We have not had technical issues on this platform before, and I'm not sure what's happening today, but I appreciate your patience.
Well, Dave, you always remember your first, so I'm glad we can be joined in eternity for this. So this is great.
Yes, correct. So where I lost you, or where I faded out, was you were talking about the trigger word should. You should have. Can you finish your thought there for us?
Sure, yeah. And so, something as simple as the word should will trigger people negatively, because very simply, when we internalize that word should, what most people, how they internalize that is the element of judgment. They're being judged. And what do we know about judgment? Two things. Number one is nobody likes to be judged. And number two, we judge ourselves and others all the time. And so, you will trigger someone's fear of looking foolish or being wrong or looking incompetent simply by using the word or a phrase, you should have done this or you shouldn't have done that. And so those are just some examples of we need to become more mindful of the words that we're using so that we're not immediately triggering someone where our message seems to get lost because people are becoming more defensive about being judged in that situation.
Great points. And I feel as though as communicators, like you mentioned earlier, we're often so concerned about how we are coming across or what we want to portray that we're not really mindful of the other side of the conversation. So that's really good to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's critical. And part of it is to recognize, again, go back to what's your intent in that conversation, but also what's your own fear. Because, again, the way that we interpret questions sometimes is through a different lens. So, in other words, let's say if for those of you that work with millennials, they may have a fear of being found out. You recently promote someone to a managerial position, and especially the millennials, when they first start out, their fears are, will I get a job, number one? Will I do a good job? Will I be a disappointment? And all these other things. And then they do a good job, and then they get promoted, and all of a sudden they're thinking, well, crap, I'm not nearly as good as they think I am. And then all of a sudden their fears shift to, is this the day that I get found out? Is this the day that I get asked a question that I don't know the answer to? And someone's going to turn to me and say, yeah, but you should know the answer to that because you're a manager now. And so the way that they start hearing questions and the way that they start interpreting what someone is asking of them all of a sudden becomes through a much different lens. It becomes through a defensive barrier. And so they're quick to respond, or they become more agitated, or they BS their way through an answer, whereas before they felt more comfortable saying, no, I'm not sure, but I'll find out. So many little things like that trigger people in remarkably different ways.
Great point. And it's interesting because, we work with companies in our consulting practice and we focus a lot on internal culture. And what also happens a lot when that millennial gets promoted and we say something like, you should have known this, typically it's not even their fault. We never told them. It wasn't part of the training process. So how could they know this if we've never painted that picture for them?
Yeah, sometimes we ask, does anyone have any questions? And no one has any questions. And we think, great, everyone must be on the same page. Right. They don't even know what questions they should be asking. So sometimes we need to help them out as well.
Excellent point. So another thing that you talk about that I think is going to be very intriguing for our audience at the Customer Service Revolution is having those difficult conversations. So we all have to do it from time to time, whether it's personal, whether it's career related. Happens a lot in customer service where someone is already unhappy, agitated, but we now have to have that conversation. Now you talk about how even in an agitated state, or even when that person is not happy, we're still able to make a connection. Can you expand on that a little bit, Pete?
Yeah, two quick things on that. Number one is anytime we're dealing with someone who's agitated, we need to make it a point to match their words. What I mean by that is it'll force us to start really paying attention to what they're saying. In other words, if they're agitated and they say something like, I think the company should have done this instead, we need to respond with, something to do with think. So if they think, you think. If they feel, you feel. If they believe, you believe. And so we need to just start matching their words to immediately create that synergy. See, what happens a lot of times is we go into default mode, and someone may say, well, I think we should have done this in this case, and we respond with, yeah, but I feel that if we have done that, we, X, Y, or Z. And all of a sudden, one person's thinking, one person's feeling, and we just continue to create the barriers between us. So if someone's agitated, the first thing we need to do is get a feel for where are they coming from? Are they coming from a logistical standpoint? Are they coming from an emotional standpoint? Are they coming from something deeply rooted, which is a belief? And we need to start matching them where they are. So first and foremost, we need to match their words. And then the second thing is to incorporate something that I believe is not discussed frequently enough, and yet the presence of this impacts our effectiveness as a communicator, as a leader, as an individual, and that's the element of humility. And if we're able to incorporate a little humility into our conversations, it's extraordinary what happens to someone's defensive mechanisms or confrontational situations. And so I'm going to share with the attendees a simple phrase to use at the beginning of a conversation that you believe might be conflict oriented. that immediately changes the whole feel and the scope of the conversation. And it's simply by incorporating a little humility into what we say and how we say it.
Fantastic tools. I know that our audience is going to be feverishly taking notes when you're speaking, because there's so many good things that you're talking about here. And another thing that I know you speak about that I'm interested in hearing is you talk about how something as simple as choice of words can really be used to build morale, to boost your team up. Can you share an example or two of that?
Yeah, one quick example is the opposite is also true. The presence of some words will crush those things. And one of the most common example I can give is the phrase "yes, but." So when we start talking about someone has a great idea, they bring it up at a meeting, and a manager or a leader turns to that person and says, "Yes, but." Yada, yada, yada. Maybe someone has a different idea. Hey, I'd like to try this. Yes, good idea. But, we tried that in 1979. It didn't work so well, and we've been hesitant to try it ever since. But just the word "but" is so critical in that sentence, because it absolutely minimizes everything that person said. And so that word will crush creativity. It'll crush initiative. It will cause people to not share ideas anymore, because we've absolutely shot down their ideas simply by saying "yes, but." And so we need to change that around. And so I'll share with the attendees how we kind of flip that on end and start using phrases that will enhance creativity, enhance our relationships, enhance those initiatives by building relationships, by getting rid of the words that absolutely destroy it.
That's great. Other great tips. So here's my last question for you, Pete.
Yeah.
As you know, the audience for the customer service revolution is primarily made up of business leaders that understand that the experience they're delivering, their customer experience, is truly what differentiates them from their competition. So they're bought in to the importance of service and experience.
Right.
My question for you is, what are you most excited about sharing with this audience? And again, this is a tough question because I have some great notes here. I have a list of 5 or 6 things you said already that I can't wait to hear more about, like the listening lens, mirroring their behaviors. You talked about so many great things. What are you most excited about delivering to an audience that is really focused on the experience they deliver?
I guess first and foremost, the difference in companies that are good, companies are great, it always comes back to individual performance. If you want to improve the company, you focus on the teams. You want to improve the team, you focus on the individual. And so every great thing that a company achieves will always come back to individual performance. And as it relates to customer service, that will always begin, as all of the things that we want in our life begin, with a choice. Do you want to provide great customer service or do you not? Do you want to be a great communicator or do you not? And so what I'm excited to share with them as it relates to customer service through the lens of communication is that there is another whole aspect of communication that my guess is many of them haven't even paid attention to, that when you start to look at communication through the entirety of everything that goes into it, your people are going to be able to provide such exceptional service because they're not just focused on what's my body language, what's my tone, what are my words, but also the other side of communication that has a drastic impact in their effectiveness. So the fact that they're going to be able to walk away and kind of see communication through a drastically different lens than what they're used to, that's what excites me the most.
Great stuff, Pete. Great stuff. I got to tell you, I find your content to be interesting, entertaining, and so useful all at the same time.
Great.
And so I can't wait to see you at the Customer Service Revolution Conference. So again, for our viewers out there, the conference is October 24th and October 25th, 2018 in beautiful Cleveland, Ohio. And if you have not purchased your tickets yet, you can at customerservicerevolution.com for all your information needs. It's there. Pete Smith, thank you so much for joining us today on the Speaker Spotlight. It was a pleasure to have you. And again, I can't wait to meet you in person in Cleveland in October.
Dave, thanks so much for having me. Can't wait to meet you in person as well.
All right. We will see you then. And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Speaker Spotlight.